Ladies and gentlemen, the show we've all been waiting for. Paranormal Buzz Radio is proud to present REP Paranormal and Friends with your hosts, Kim Purvis and Allison Robinson. Live every Thursday night on Spreaker, 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 Central, 5 Pacific. Be sure to check out their Facebook page, REP Paranormal Busters.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast by the host or the guest do not necessarily reflect the views of Paranormal Buzz Radio or its sponsors. Use of any material produced by Paranormal Buzz Radio without express written consent is strictly prohibited. For information on everything Paranormal Buzz Radio has to offer, visit our website, paranormalbuzzradio.com. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome everybody to another night of REP Paranormal and Friends. We have a special guest tonight. We have Rob Garcia from Elite Paranormal Kansas City, and also the co-owner of the Garnett Hotel House. So welcome.
Wow, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. So for some of the people in chat that may not know who you are, can you give us a little bit of background on yourself and how you got introduced to the paranormal?
Right, yeah. Well, my name is Rob Garcia, and I live in Kansas City metro area. And I started in the paranormal probably around 2004, 2005. And I kind of started out getting invited to a historical location by some folks. And they were starting a group at that time. Ended up being called Kansas City Paranormal Research. Mm-hmm. And that was my first organization. It lasted about 2 years, I would say up to about 2007. We investigated around this area quite a bit during that time period. A lot of historical locations that still people are investigating even today, all these years later. And then I do come from a history background. I have education in history and computer science, but I do the computer science stuff for a living. Mm-hmm. So, but once that organization kind of ran its course, we kind of broke off, a couple members of that and formed Elite Paranormal of Kansas City right about 2007. And it still exists all the way up till 2020. It's kind of more of an occasional thing now, with everyone kind of gotten older, gotten busier, your life changes. But it's, we still exist, and, we go out and investigate here every once in a while. It's just kind of a little more low-key now than it was back in the early days. But that's kind of how I started in the paranormal, mostly from a history background, but, it quickly grew into, the love of paranormal research and investigating historic locations and kind of the hidden history behind them. That's kind of been my passion and love when it comes to the paranormal.
That's awesome. Especially when you have a place with a lot of history, especially like the Garnett Hotel. That place, I was reading about it, has quite a bit of history, and a lot of famous people have gone through there. How did you get introduced to that place?
Well, about 3 years ago, I had done, to step back a little bit, I had done the John Warnell House and the Alexander Majors House. I had done most of their public investigations for going on probably a decade. And for those who don't know, those are both antebellum mansions that exist here in the Kansas City area. Mm-hmm. There's not many left. A lot of the antebellum mansions were destroyed during the Civil War, but those two survived. So they are both museums run by the Warnell Majors organization, and they do public paranormal investigations, usually on Halloween time. They don't really do as many during the year, but so I did all their public investigations for about a decade, and then I had been interested in a historical location that I could kind of put my stamp on and kind of bring to life. And I had wanted to do something where I could kind of control the situation and call the shots on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was partnered up with another gentleman named Justin Spurrier, and we were out looking at some schools in rural Kansas and some other locations. Now, to find such a location in the city is almost impossible. They're either owned or it's beyond possible to even own such a place here. But so we had looked at these schools, and there was one we were considering buying out in the middle of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
And because there's lots of them out in Kansas, there's these little towns, they get old and the people leave and the schools die. But I don't know, something said, to my partner and I that let's do one more search. And he did a search and he came up with this place called the Garnett House. And, then they didn't really have a whole lot. I mean, they just kind of had a brief history in the listing. But, it said that it had been, a hotel in the 19th century, and that it had a famous guest list of like Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok,
Mm-hmm.
Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, and several other people. And it, and that was intriguing alone. And so we decided to go look at the location, and it's about an hour away from me here in Kansas City, and it was an hour away from him. So we went down and we met the realtor, and after I began to explore the history of the place, and unfolded it a little bit more, it just got more and more exciting. And
Mm-hmm.
It was like, and I think, we saw that if we probably didn't purchase the Garnett House, it was probably going to be destroyed.
Oh, yeah.
I think that the town they really didn't have it in their minds that this was a historic landmark versus it was really known as the doctor's office in that town. And it still is for a lot of people because it was owned by husband and wife doctors for 60 years.
Yeah.
So they didn't really see it in its 19th century history and its potential. So we met the realtor, and we were standing in I guess you would say it's a kitchen, but it's the laboratory. The doctors were their own pharmacists. But it's in the back of the building, and we were standing there talking to the realtor, and the back door flew open.
Oh, wow.
And we heard this little girl's voice kind of giggle and say something kind of in between us. And Justin and I both looked at each other and went, "What just happened?" And the realtor's just talking away. She has no idea.
Uh-huh.
What we being experienced paranormal investigators,
Right.
we instantly knew what we knew what just happened. So, that instantly intrigued us even more. And so we decided, we have to be involved here and try and save this place. And so that's ended up being the place that we obtained. And here 3 years later, it's slowly starting to kind of come around. It's taken a while, but it's a lot of work for that location. It's, a lot of years of neglect there. So,
Mm-hmm.
It's just a little bit at a time. And, here it is 2020 and I'm still going strong.
That's awesome. And, it's open for investigations, correct?
Yes. So it's kind of all the investigations that we have, they kind of pay for a lot of the restoration work that we have going on. The last couple of years, the building's been getting a paint job on the outside. And then, I'm raising money for the new gutters and downspouts because every time it really rains, our basement floods because the gutters are long destroyed and gone. So all the investigations go towards that and keeping the place running, basically.
That's cool. That's awesome. Excuse me. Had to sneeze there for a minute. You did bring up a little bit about the history, but could you go in depth a little bit more?
Yeah. So the Garnett House is one of the original buildings in Garnett, Kansas. It started out as a private residence for a lawyer and his wife named D.W. Houston. They moved here from Pennsylvania, from around the Harrisburg area. They were abolitionists, as were many of the settlers in the early days of Garnett in 1858. And so he built this building for his wife, and it was just 2 rooms down and 2 rooms up to start. And the whole area at that time was very unsettled. So, I mean, this was very early in Kansas history, and the area was kind of under contention between Missourians and Kansans and the new Kansans as to make this whether a slave or a free state. So this area was known as Bleeding Kansas at that time. There was a lot of violence, a lot of eye-for-eye killings and things like that. But this gentleman, he was kind of a well-to-do man. He was very influential. He's one of the town fathers, D.W. Houston. So his wife decided she didn't like this location, didn't like the building. She said it swayed in the wind. I guess coming from Pennsylvania, I guess Kansas is a lot more windy than she was used to.
Yeah.
So he gave over the building within its first year to a gentleman named Hiram Teft to make it into a hotel. Now, I'm not sure if he actually sold it to him, but I think he was the overall owner. But Hiram Teft immediately begins to turn this into a hotel and expand on the building. Now, in the early days, in the late 1850s, 1858, 1859, this building is listed as the center of the Underground Railroad in Garnett. So we do know, and I have found documentation, that John Brown, and for those who don't know, John Brown is a famous kind of a violent abolitionist from this area. He lived in Osawatomie, which is just up the road from Garnett. And he believed in freeing the slaves by force. So he was known to raid into Missouri and steal slaves away from their owners on the different farms out in western Missouri and take them back to Kansas. And Garnett House is one of the drop-off points. They would hide the slaves before they sent them off to Canada. So we don't know if they hid them in the basement or in the attic, but that it is documented that slaves were transported through the Garnett House, especially around the late 1850s. Now, John Brown isn't around in Kansas too long. He leaves Kansas and goes east to around Washington, D.C., and for history's sake, he puts together a raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is a federal arsenal, thinking that with his band of men, he could kick off a slave rebellion and that slaves in the area would flock to his cause and, he could overturn slavery. But it didn't work. He was cornered in a building there with a lot of his followers, and several of them were killed, including a couple of his sons. And he was captured by U.S. Marines led by Robert E. Lee, who went on to become the general of the Confederate Army in the Civil War. But John Brown was captured and he hung for his crimes and for that raid, and that ends his time in history. But the Garnett House continues on as a hotel, and we have some big events around the early 1860s. One of them is there was a woman who was a black widow. She was I'll step back. She came to Kansas from out east. She met a couple named the Aldermans. Her name was Sarah Potter. They introduced her to a young gentleman, a German farmer named Leon Phillips. As was the custom in the times, they had a short courtship and they were married. And shortly thereafter, Mr. Phillips died within 6 weeks of the marriage. And it turns out that she fell under suspicion for this, of course, and it turns out she had been buying rabbit poison from the pharmacist. And rabbit poison is also known as arsenic. So it turns out that she had poisoned her new husband, probably to get his land. So her and the aldermans were arrested by the sheriff. There was no police force back then. And the sheriff had no jail. There was no jail in the area. So he put her in the Garnett House for 4 months as a prisoner.
Oh, wow.
Now, As a hotel, this is a small building, so you ate communally with everybody. There are very few small hotel rooms upstairs. So she probably bunked with somebody. She could have visitors. Her friends could visit her. She ate communally with everybody downstairs. But she was there around 4 months. The aldermans were exonerated. So she's awaiting trial. Then suddenly a mysterious buggy comes to town one night, and Sarah Potter/Phillips disappears. And they don't know what happened to her. She escapes.
Oh,
Turns out she goes back east to Cincinnati, marries some other guy. I don't know if she killed that guy, but for some reason she comes back to Kansas. Someone sees her, figures out who she is. She's arrested. They have a trial for her up in Lawrence, Kansas area, and she has a mistrial and is not convicted of the crime, and she leaves the area for good, and she's never seen again, back here at least. But she is a Black Widow murderess. We're pretty sure she killed him, and she was kept a prisoner there at the hotel.
Oh, wow. That's insane.
So we move on to the Civil War. This is kind of the same time. But this area during the Civil War was highly contested over by Confederate guerrillas. And in 1864, this area was very terrified of Quantrill's raiders. Now, the reason why is 6 miles to the southeast of Garnett, there is a member of Quantrill's raiders and Bloody Bill Anderson's company who had a ranch there. His name was, I'm drawing a blank on his name. John Rutledge. And John Rutledge is listed as a member of both of those units. But he had a natural guerrilla fort on his property. And Quantrill's raiders was said to hide arms and powder and things like that there on his property. And that would be a place they would go to get off the grid. Well, in 1864 in October, the area is terrified of the Confederate Army, which is retreating from the Battle of Westport, which happens in what is today Kansas City. And they are headed south through Kansas, and they were headed for Arkansas. But they're caught from behind by the Union cavalry at a place called Mine Creek, which is to the east of this area. And during that battle, the Confederate guerrillas are circling the area like scouts. So the people of Garnett are terrified that they're going to raid the town and steal all their valuables. Well, this ties back to the Garnett house because there was a gentleman who lived in the attic space. He was a freed African American. His name was John Warren. He was one of D.W. Houston's hand servants. So he worked for Mr. Colonel Houston, because Colonel Houston was the head of the Union Army Regiment there in Garnett. So on this night in October, at the same time this Battle of Mine Creek is happening in Pleasanton, Kansas, where it's the biggest battle. It's the biggest cavalry battle west of the Mississippi. It happens in Kansas. And at the same time, over in Garnett, everyone's burying their valuables. They're hiding their stuff. They're terrified because most of the men are gone in the Civil War. Just the old men remain. But at the same time, there's this traveling doctor coming through named Dr. Derby. And Dr. Derby's giving a lecture in downtown Garnett. Dr. Derby is a phrenology doctor who studies the shape of your head to determine your intellect. So everyone turns out for this lecture in town, including this daughter of this woman down the street named Mrs. Adeline Duran. She's an original settler of Garnett. She's about 45 years old. Her daughter's grown. Daughter goes to the lecture to see Dr. Derby. Mom stays home reading by the fire in her house. So we tie this back to John Warren because John Warren decides he's going to go to the lecture. He goes down the street. This is only about a block away from the Garnett house. I don't know what's in his mindset, but he looks in, I guess sees Mrs. Duran reading by the fire, gets an axe from the wood pile, goes inside with the axe, hits Mrs. Duran in the back of the head while she's reading with the blunt end of the axe, knocking her unconscious, has his way with her. She wakes up, dazed, tries to escape. John Warren stops her, hits her with the blade into the axe, pretty much severing her head. and he's trying to rob the place. I don't know if he feels regret for what he's done, but he throws the axe into the woodpile, takes off back to Garnett House, and along the way he's seen by a African-American boy named Robert. And so John Warren goes back to the Garnett House, goes up in the attic, which still exists today. It's not as nice probably as when he lived there, but he goes up there and goes to sleep. Mm-hmm. So the daughter comes back from the lecture, finds mom without her head, puts out the alarm. All the men start running all over the place looking for who could have done the crime. They trace it back to Robert, who says, I saw John Warren coming from there. So a bunch of men go up there, drag John Warren out of the attic. They see he has blood on his clothes. They take him downtown. They get a confession from him, and John Warren confesses to the crime. They have a short trial, and then John Warren is hung downtown Garnett from the rafters of the unfinished jail, severing his head in the hanging.
Oh, wow.
And it's said that over 1,000 people turned out for his hanging, and it made the New York Times in its day. Now, kind of a weird, kind of sick note to the whole thing was that they gave his head to Dr. Derby, this phrenology professor who was giving the lecture for study. And they gave his body to the Negro community for burial, which is how it's documented. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of weird that they gave his head away, but that's what happened. Now, I have talked to...
They gave his head away. That's just...
Yeah,
mind-blowing.
Weird. I've talked to descendants of the Houstons, and they don't think John Warren did this crime because it's kind of a why. He had kind of a great position for a freed African American in that time because he was a freedman. He was a former slave, so it didn't make sense that why he would do this. Because he was working for one of the most prominent men in Garnett. So we'll never really know. Even in an abolitionist community, was he an easy target, easy scapegoat? But he did confess, and they did find blood. So that's what's documented. So we'll never truly know whether he was the absolute murderer. But he was an axe murderer according to history, and he lived in the attic of the hotel. So
that is, yeah, I did read about that, but I guess I missed the part where they gave his head away.
Yeah, that is documented as well. So I'm not just
wow.
I put that in the documentation. So that's kind of a couple of really strange events that center around the hotel. When the hotel moves into like the 1870s, it becomes really prominent as a hotel even more. It's constantly being expanded upon. I have in the documentation, we have the Kansas plot maps of the hotel, which are created every 10 years back in those days. And every time you look at the hotel, it's a totally different shape. And so they were constantly changing it and building on it. So when its maximum size, it reached 15 hotel rooms, which is pretty big for a board and batten structure. But during that time period, it had a very famous guest list come through, and that is men like Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill Cody, and they did frequent the hotel, especially Hickok, quite frequently, because he is a prominent figure in western Kansas, or eastern Kansas and western Missouri, as well as Cody, because they were both Kansas Jayhawkers during the war. Also, it's said that Belle Starr stayed there, Wyatt Earp during his early days, as they were headed west. And Bat Masterson during his early days, because all of these people came from Missouri, and they were headed out west to make their fortunes. Bat Masterson ended up being the sheriff in Dodge City. Hickok was in Abilene for a while. So and Garnett was a lot like those towns during this time period. And it's a very quaint little town now, but back then it was kind of Wild West with a lot like Tombstone and Abilene with, shootings, not much of a police force, and open air brothels and things like that, saloons. So you had a lot of comings and goings. Now, it's also rumored that the James brothers frequented the hotel during that time period, especially during their outlaw days, because they were buddies with a gentleman during the Civil War. They rode with him, who lived 6 miles southeast of Garnett, named John Rutledge. Now, it's been told to me by the locals that the James brothers also went to John Rutledge's ranch during their outlaw years as a kind of retreat from when things were hot. It's been told to me that they did build a prefabricated house on John Rutledge's ranch, and they would come down on the train from the Kansas City area where they were from, the heat was on, under assumed names. And, if you wanted to go to a bar, the Garnett House was one of the places that had one. And if you've ever been to the James Farm up in Kearney, Missouri, which is north of Kansas City, it's a log cabin with a prefabricated house stuck on one end like a T. So, it makes sense that they would put a prefabricated house on John Rutledge's ranch. And that's been told me by many that it partially still stands, but I haven't had a chance to actually go see it. So I hope to sometime and see what's left of it. But so it's said the James brothers visited the hotel quite a bit as well during that time period. Now, we did have a lot of, comings and goings of the hotel. It was the only hotel in town at that time until about the 20th century. So, it's run as, the Garnett House is what its name was. It was called the Lighthouse Hotel in its very early days because in the front of it, if you see the pictures, there's some shutters right up in the front. And they used to put a candle up there, and it said in the covered wagons coming into town could see that from 7 miles away.
Oh, wow.
So they use it as kind of a guiding light. And it does sit on the highest point in Garnett. So, it runs as a hotel as the Garnett House, the commercial house, until about the beginning of the 20th century where it's kind of ending its run. It's kind of rustic for those times. Things are getting modern. They finally get a police force in Garnett. Things are calming down. The final days, it's said that Harry Houdini and his wife Beth stayed there in around 1897 because they did a spiritualist show before he was a famous escape artist. There was, and it's documented, they did perform in Garnett at the Opera House downtown. And so they were known to, that has been told to me that there was no other hotel, so that was where they stayed. So it was Garnett House. So we got Harry Houdini at the very tail end. So they finally build a brick hotel downtown. And the Garnett House gets split into 3 pieces. And we have 1/3 of the hotel. The other 2 were also made into private residences. And we believe one of them has been demolished, and we believe another part still stands today because we have the history of the names of who owned them. And then, as it moves into the 20th century, it's a school for a period, a photography studio for a period, and then it's known as it's been told to me, and I don't have any documentation of this, that it was a brothel possibly during Prohibition times for a small period of time, until about the 1950s, where it's purchased by husband and wife doctors, the Stevens, who came there from KU and opened it as their practice, which they practiced in up until the 21st century when they retired. So, it's got a lot of different uses. It's got a lot of history and a lot of comings and going. And believe me, it's taken a lot of work to memorize all that because
I bet.
Every investigator gets to hear those stories when they come. And I'm leaving out tons because there's, lots of things. There was supposedly a shooting in there. Some guy dropped dead of a heart attack. And they used the place as wedding stop, as there were said to be funerals in there, because that's what you did back in the 19th century. You didn't have funeral homes. You had them in your house.
Right.
And that place also is known as a stagecoach stop. That when you were coming in on the stagecoach from up around Kansas City and Ottawa and Lawrence, that's where they would have dropped you off if you were going to stay in Garnett. Was right there.
That's crazy. Yeah, there is.
Gotta get drinking water. Whew.
That's fine. Yeah, I mean, I was just reading because I had gone onto the website and I was looking up because I wasn't familiar with it, and I'm like, I was telling Kim when I came over here, I'm like, oh my gosh, we have to get there. Like,
Yep.
it sounds so interesting, and some of the things that I have seen that have happened there, like with those balls just flying out.
Yeah, and all that happened out of flukes, because really the paranormal part of it, we always thought, well, we heard that little girl, like I told you the first day.
Right, yeah.
Like, well, there's going to be activity that goes on here.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I approach things more from a history perspective. I love the paranormal,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm always like, well, you know what? I got to get in the books. I got to research. I got to figure this out because, that's my background. But, but then the paranormal stuff started happening right away. And you'd be downstairs and you'd hear like boots walk upstairs. And so, in the very first 3 months, so the place was a total disaster. They had pretty much just left it behind as from his doctor's office era. So they probably hadn't been upstairs in a couple decades. And it was stacked chest high with medical supplies throughout the upstairs. And it took us almost 3 months just to get it emptied out and sort through what was upstairs. Now, they left behind jars of vitamins, boxes and crates of birth control pills from the 1960s.
Oh, wow.
You name it. And it was stacked upstairs. And so that took a lot of effort for just two of us to get it cleaned out. And I'm still going through stuff even today, 3 years later. But, it took quite a bit of effort. And, but during that time, we're noticing like voices behind you, shadows moving around, things like that. You'd hear movement downstairs. You'd hear movement upstairs. You'd hear it in the next room. And so what started happening is we started to put in like voice-activated recorders when we'd leave. Because we're too tired to investigate.
Yeah.
So when we started having small investigations in there ourselves, and we'd leave this voice-activated audio, and we'd come back and retrieve them the next day, and you'd have the sounds of like, walking, talking, screaming. One time it sounded like something was tearing one of the rooms to shreds, and nothing's moved, So we put up like, okay, well, is there like an animal in here doing that so that we're not seeing? So we put like together like some kind of like trap, not a trap where you trap the animal. It's something that they'd have to pass through to knock it down, Or we put the, we had trap cameras that for wildlife we put in there. We'd go back, nothing on the trap camera. The things we set up for the animal to knock over hasn't been moved. But you'd still hear these sounds and stuff inside this audio. And it would sound like water splashing and glass breaking and chains, yelling, moans, kids screaming, all kinds of weird stuff. And, that went on for a while. We were doing investigations like that and just kind of like going, wow, this is crazy. And my partner, Justin, he likes to use these ping pong balls, set them up, see if they move, things like that, trigger objects.
Right. Yep.
And so we captured the sounds like we're not there, so we just have the voice-activated audio. And you'd hear sounds like these ping pong balls being bounced off stuff. It'd like sound like it was being bounced off the recorder, and then bounced downstairs, bounced off in some other room, and then, it'd hit the recorder again. But the ping pong ball would never move. It's still in the same spot. And so, this weird kind of, stuff like that you couldn't explain. And so, as time went on, we had some friends visit and things like that. And then, so kind of the paranormal investigations kind of started from that. And then once we had the building kind of in a state where we felt, people could come in there, that's when we kind of started the public. And it took about a year at least before we were comfortable with people publicly coming to investigate there. And we did, the live streams on Paranormal Warehouse for quite a while. We set up a camera in there, and they would stream 4 hours at a time because there was just so much stuff that would go on and that would get captured in the video or in the audio of the video. So that's kind of how the ball coming out of the closet thing started.
Yeah.
I went to Cancun, and I bought these with my family, and I bought some beach balls for my kids. These light up beach balls, and they were cheap, so I bought an extra one and took it to Garnett House. And so, got sick of kicking it around upstairs, so I threw it up in this closet that's in there's an original 2 up, 2 down in the front of the building where there's a ladder that goes up to the attic. We call that the ladder room. And that would have been John Warren, the African-American man's room up there. But in that closet, we put this ball up there just to get it out of the way. Well, we had some friends come down and do kind of a benefit on YouTube investigation to kind of raise money for the Garnett House for some of the things we were doing. And they had a reporter with them from Joplin. She was a TV reporter, and she'd never been on a paranormal investigation before in her life. And so they're upstairs investigating, and they're talking, and all of a sudden they're in this middle room up there, and you see in this video all of a sudden this light up beach ball come flying out of the closet and rolls into the room with them. And they're like, you see them turn and they go look at it, they're like, what the heck just happened? So they are, it's like, okay, well, once is a fluke. So they put the ball back up there. And later in the night, the ball does the same thing. It flies out of there and starts rolling around. And they twice is getting crazy. So we started putting the ball up in there and leaving it. But one thing we noticed is when you put that up in that closet, the Garnett House has a slight lean to it. And it's lean for over 100 plus years. But that closet kind of has a little lean to it in its back. So the ball is leaning away from the edge of the shelf. So to come out of there, it has to have momentum.
Right.
And we have a camera in there, and we were doing the Paranormal Warehouse live streams. But what people didn't know is that we also have motion cameras in there that notify us that they're security cameras, because that's our only way to know if someone kicks the door in or something.
Right, yeah.
So we started capturing this ball flying out of that closet on a frequent basis. So we probably have over 20 plus clips of that ball. Just, nobody's there. It's in the middle of the day. It's in the middle of the night. It's random. And then here comes that ball, and it'll come flying out of that closet. And the thing about it is, we started putting like these dolls up on the doors and things like that. Because, it's something to look at when people were live streaming. But started finding out the dolls would also they'd sit up there for weeks in certain positions, in certain places. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, they'd come flying off the tops of these shelves or these doors into the middle of the floor, in the middle of the room.
Oh, wow.
And that started to happen with some frequency. So that was kind of how you see all in the video, all these dolls and stuff sitting around in there, and that's kind of how that all transpired. Was they move, and they move randomly, and you don't know when it's going to happen. So, I have tons of security footage of the dolls that will topple out of nowhere, and I don't even post it all. There's so much, so it's it's completely random, and you never know what's going to happen, and it happens a lot when nobody's there.
I was just watching that, and that ball was just like boom, boom, boom. I'm like, what in the heck? And then there was one, I think it was a ball sitting up on top of the door. I think it was a ball. There was something small sitting on top of a door, and you see that shooting out. I think that might have been a YouTube video I was watching.
Yeah, so I put together a lot of them for last year's Kansas City Paracon. I put together a compilation of some of those clips. I think the one with the reporters in there, and then the ones that some of the security camera where it's just, here comes the ball, and the camera goes, what? And it turns and looks at it.
Yes, I saw that, yeah.
So I put some of that stuff together, and some of the audio clips in there. I have so much more out there, on my Elite Paranormal of Kansas City YouTube. a bunch of other EVPs and things because I brought my team in there and investigated it, and we captured quite a bit. But it's definitely up there as active places I've ever been, and I've been, gosh, a couple hundred investigations since 2005. So a lot of places. So it's very active. It's just random though. It's very strange.
Yeah, everybody in chat's telling me I need to go there because of my run-in with dolls. So,
yeah. So I've been working though towards it being a Kansas State Historic Site. That's kind of been my efforts as of late. There's a lot of background research work going on right now to make that presentation. So I think the dolls are. If I start doing history tours, I think all the dolls are going to have to go in their little crib and hang out until such time as they're needed back on the doors, just so people don't walk in for the history tour and go, why are these dolls sitting up on the door jamb?
Yeah, they'd be like, what? These dolls
what's going on here? Yeah.
All right, let's see here. Okay, so I know you do a radio show, right? Do you do it specifically on this location, or what's your radio show about?
Oh, I don't do a radio show, actually.
Oh, you don't? I thought you did.
No.
I just read your thing.
I've been on a lot of radio shows over the years.
Okay, maybe that's what it was.
But no, I don't have one of my own. It always was one of those things I thought about, and my day job is so unpredictable that I could never guarantee I was going to be available when the time I set for the radio show. So that's kind of the reason why it never happened. Healthcare IT is sometimes not a 8 to 5 gig. So
yeah, I can imagine that for sure. Let's see here. What other locations have you been to?
So I investigated quite a lot, especially through 2005 through 2014. Now, once I went into Garnett House, I kind of slowed a little bit as far as investigating a lot of new locations. But a lot of the places I've been, like Warnell House in Kansas City, Alexander Major's house. We did have a My Ghost Story episode for Alexander Major's house. Gosh, it's been over 12 years ago now. It's been a long time. So I had an episode of that. I worked with a remote viewer. His name's Harvey Althouse. He's a pretty amazing guy. And we used to do kind of a live kind of phone, back and forth live phone conference thing at our investigations. And we captured so much evidence doing that. But he did a lot with me at Alexander Major's house and Warnell House. But a lot of places I've been, I like battlefields. So I've been to a lot of places like Centralia Battlefield in Missouri. Back in the early days, I went to like 1859 jail in Independence. One of the places I investigated originally was a place called McIntyre Villa.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of it. Haven't been there yet. It's a place we want to go. But
I was brought in by the family that used to live there before it was a location. So my team was brought in to investigate that. I used to do a lot of private residences back in the day, so probably did over 60 private residences in my previous time. I don't do them so much anymore, but if I feel like it's something that they are definitely in need, I will come out and do those. But I make them jump through a lot of hoops before I'll come to your private residence. I won't slide down a pole and jump in the ghost mobile, but I will. I feel if it's something desperate going on, I definitely will lend credence to those. I've been to a lot of places like Waverly Hills back in the day. A place called Sigma Nu. It's in Lawrence, Kansas.
Never heard
it's also known as Wind Hill. It's actually a fraternity at KU.
Oh, wow.
But it's also the former governor's residence name. Walter Stubbs. It's not the governor's house. That's in Topeka, but this was his private residence. And there was a big legend around it, and the fraternity boys used to see a spirit walking through there. And so we did 2 investigations of that location. And that's quite one of my most favorite places I ever investigated. Did a lot of stuff in Tombstone. Gosh, the list goes on. There's so many now, I'd almost have to go back and revise my memory. Have you ever been to the Elms Hotel? Is one of them that I've done. That's in Excelsior Springs. The Gore Psychiatric Museum in St. Joe. Did that many years ago. Gosh, the list goes on and on.
Wow.
So many that I've started to lose my memory of them. If that makes sense. After 15 years.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I wouldn't be able to remember every place.
Sally House. Williska
That's another place,
Axmar
Sally
House.
House, we want to get to. That's on our
Williska
list.
House a few times, which is a crazy place. It can be really quiet, or it can be off just totally nuts. Farrar School is one I've done.
Oh, yeah, we've been there many times.
One of my favorites is a place called Rockcliffe Mansion. It's in Hannibal, Missouri.
I just read about that.
Now the reason, I don't know if they let you investigate there anymore, but back then they did, and this was many years ago now. But the reason why I love that one so much is a lot of people don't know I grew up in Hannibal, Missouri. The Rockcliffe Mansion was up the cliff above my elementary school. So we used to climb that cliff, and we used to play in that yard as kids in the Rockcliffe Mansion's yard, and we used to run around it. And actually, the original owner was a lumber baron named John J. Cruikshank, and he died in the house. He died in the Garnett, or not the Garnett house. He died in the Rockcliffe Mansion, and when he died, his family just shut the mansion with all the belongings in it and moved next door. They just left it behind.
What?
And it sat that way for decades, just with everything in it. And his daughter actually lived next door, and she was a very old lady at the time. But she used to peek out her curtains at us and would freak us all out, and we'd run down the hill. But so that place was kind of a dream come true for me. You know, it was a childhood location that, I went to and played in. So to get to investigate there as a professional investigator was just over the top for me. I asked them always why I want to go back. Please consider me if you ever open back up to.
Oh yeah, no kidding.
But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of places. So many places I like to go. Like Mine Creek Battlefield was one we were brought in by the Kansas State Historic Society to investigate. That's probably one of the very most difficult investigations I ever did, because Mine Creek Battlefield, it's really just an open field with a creek. And I investigated it during the day. Then I came back at night later. And at night, it's like investigating a jungle. And you're basically carrying all your equipment on your back. So to prelude that investigation, what I did was I set up these big speakers, and I got all this like cavalry music and sounds of horses and broadcast them out into the battlefield, so to kind of seed the environment. Mm-hmm. So you have all these sounds on these big speakers before we investigated of cavalry bugles and sounds of men fighting and horses and things like that. And so then we investigated it, and like I said, it's like walking around in a jungle at night, and trying to listen to the audio for it and get EVPs was almost impossible. But it was still a great experience, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. But I love those kind of places. Anything that's off the beaten track, that's not widely investigated, that's what I like. That's the kind of places I enjoy. Places down south, Kendrick House, there's a bunch. There's so many places I've been that, they're all great. I love to go all these historic landmarks. That's my favorite investigating.
There you go. That's awesome. We'd like to get out of state.
Definitely.
Eventually we'll get there, but
You know,
I'm
and
planning on it.
it takes you have to just ride this field as pits and valleys, because there are times where I'm just too busy to investigate, and then there's times where the bug hits and I want to get out. You know, I'll probably look to go to another this year if things change and we're able to go out. You know, I want to return to a couple historic landmarks out in mid-Missouri. Like there's a place at Lexington Battlefield that I've investigated. It's got some of the most crazy video EVPs I captured there ever, of a woman just talking with a full-blown voice. And I never heard her, but in the video you hear her talking. And it's called Anderson House, and it's on the site of the Lexington Civil War battle, where they fought for this house, and some Confederate soldiers were murdered on the staircase. And so it's got kind of a crazy history that way. But you know, I want to go back there, and you know, there's a few others that I haven't even been to. There's some places in Iowa I haven't been, and you know, I just need to get back out and hit them and check them out, see what they're about. So there's always more. There's always more places to go.
Yes, there is. I'm always learning new places, so it's like, oh, put this on the list.
Yeah, we just keep every guest we have. Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Keep a list of the places. Yeah. So if you go out to my website, eliteparanormalkc.com, if you go on my investigations page, if you want to look at my history of investigations, now they're not all on there. There's probably 30 plus private residences that aren't on there. I used to put almost every investigation I went on and everything I captured there on the website. Now, I don't do that so much anymore, just because it's so painstaking to put it to go through the evidence and post it to a website. So maybe I'll get back to that someday, but we'll see. But I still have it out there, all the old stuff. So if you want to check that stuff out, there's a lot of places you'll see where I went that I probably have forgotten and can't bring them off my top of my mind at this point.
And I'll post that information on our social media too. So if anybody who's listening didn't quite catch it, they'll know where to find you and look up some of the investigations and things that you have done, which will be awesome because, I was looking at some of that stuff and it was pretty cool. We do have some questions here before we start wrapping things up from chat. So I'm just going to go through these here quickly with you. One of the questions was they want to know, how many spirits do you think are in the Garnett house?
Oh, that's a good question. See, here's the thing about my point of view, and this gets to my paranormal belief. I don't believe in ghosts trapped in a three-dimensional space. So I don't believe spirits just sit inside these buildings and roam around. I believe they come and go. And I believe that multiples can come and go. So my viewpoint is they're not there all the time, and that they're coming and going from other locations, and that they're able to do this. Partially because I don't believe the spirits are all there. So I don't believe like the spirit of Mr. Jones is always in Garnett House upstairs. I believe that part of him may be, but part of him comes in and he's there fully at times. But he's also somewhere else at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So I think, I've captured children in there, men, women, but are they all there all the time? I mean, I'm there all the time by myself, and they're not always making themselves known to me. There's times where it's just quiet as can be. So are they coming and going? So I don't think we'll ever, in any of these investigations, truly know, are these spirits, if they're spirits, are there all the time. They're coming. I believe they're coming and going all the time. That's my long-winded answer.
Nope, that's a good answer too. A very good answer. All right, the next question is, what is your favorite equipment you like to use?
So my favorite equipment is the old-fashioned stuff. The audio recorder, the EMF meter, and now I like a fancy EMF meter. I don't use K2s, or I have millimeters, but I don't really use them. But I like to differentiate between extremely low frequency EMF, very low frequency EMF, and AC EMF. Now I have a meter that does that. So that tells me like if I'm picking up the electricity out of the wall. And I look for those very low frequency and extremely low frequency EMFs. That's one of my favorite pieces of equipment to use. Now I do have EMF meters with the flashing lights. And now I like those just to tell me when there's a signal, more than telling me that I'm talking to Colonel Mustard in the ballroom with the hammer or whatever. But so what I do is I like to triangulate. So I'll take that EMF information, and then I try to tie that back to the same time if I have EVPs or any other type of activity like anything captured in video or anything like that. And then I try to triangulate that stuff. That's kind of my methodology of investigating. It's hard to tie stuff back to a historical event and say, yeah, it was Colonel Mustard. It was him. So, but I definitely do that, my due diligence in trying that. But those are probably my, video camera. I use all those things because you can get for all the fancy stuff I own, the fancy cameras and the full spectrum stuff, I still get the best stuff from the old fashioned things. The original equipment I own. I still use the original audio recorders I had from 2005.
Wow. I have my old camcorder. We haven't used it in a while because tapes are kind of expensive for it now. But, I had the little cassette tapes. But it actually works really well. It has night vision and everything. And, we've got some unexplained things on there that we can't.
Only the tapes only last 2 hours.
Yeah,
so
the tapes only last 2 hours.
Now mine are electronic, but they, like I said, I still use them. I have new ones, and I still go back to the old ones. I have the fancy Zoom ones, and they don't get the results that my old ones get.
Gosh, yeah. All right. Let's see here. We have another one here. What is the most memorable investigation you have done?
Oh, gosh. So there's a couple. I did a private residence for some folks in Lawrence once, and they were just kind of kids, really kind of college kids. But it was just a normal ranch house, and I don't know if they were into a crazy lifestyle, because I find dark cases, the people are into dark lifestyles. That's just a connection I've made over the years by doing these. Now, there wasn't anything demonic. I would never throw the demonic term out there. I'm not qualified to make that judgment. But there was a lot of really dark EVPs in there, and we were all down in the cellar, the basement there, and the same time upstairs in the kitchen, there's something walking, like pounding like the floor, like walking back and forth in this kitchen. And this kitchen had stairs that came downstairs to the cellar. So when you went up the stairs into the kitchen from the basement, that was the only way up there. But yet this whatever was walking to that doorway down, like it was looking down at us, and going back. That was probably one of the most memorable investigations I've done, just because of the sheer amount of evidence that I was seeing and hearing at the time. Liska Axe Murder House was up there for one of my visits. I had some stuff I can't say publicly that happened, but it's pretty crazy investigation there. Had so many, so much great evidence out there. So many things happen. Some of the private residences, quite honestly, were some of the most memorable investigations, just because you think, it's always going to happen in this historic landmark, but, sometimes these private residences, you go to them and nothing happens, nothing that the people are telling you, so you can't really judge if they're, on the level. But sometimes you go and, man, it's just crazy. Just things are happening like crazy. I had another one, and it was kind of, like I said, Harvey Althouse and I used to do that cross voice phone thing, and we used to get EVPs through the phone. That
Oh,
makes
wow.
sense. And I've got a whole line of experiments going into that where EVPs come through the phone.
Oh,
And
wow.
we had one where, and you capture them because you're recording these sessions. And, I had one where I was investigating this home in a part of Kansas City for these people, and they were seeing all kinds of crazy stuff. And so Harvey can't see me. He's just doing it with his remote vision. And he's saying, Rob, you need to go here to this place, and you need to put your EMF meter out into this space. So I'm doing that, and I'm holding this phone in one hand and this EMF meter out in this space that he's seeing in his mind. And all of a sudden, over the cell phone, this woman's voice comes through because he's seeing an old lady in this place. And you hear this old woman's voice come through the cell phone, goes, "Don't touch me," with this while I'm waving this EMF meter around.
Oh, my gosh.
And we have that recorded. It's out there on my website somewhere. But that's an instance of, some of the crazy stuff that happens with that. The funny part is the next day, it was a young couple with kids that lived there. So the guy that lived there told me the next day, and it was just a normal ranch house where you see down the hall, and there's 3 bedrooms going off the hallway. And if you looked at that hallway, the TV was next to the wall. He's laying on the couch watching TV, he said, and like down the hallway, you could pass from one bedroom across the hall to the next. Mm-hmm. He sees this woman walk across he's by himself and he's watching the Chiefs, and he sees this woman walk across, but at the same, as she walks across from room to room, her eyes and her face are locked on his face as he's laying on the couch, and her head never moves. So it's like she walks across with her head locked on him from room to room, and he freaks out, and he calls me, and he runs in there, and there's no woman to be found. And, they still always would continue to see and hear this woman in the house rattling around in the kitchen at night. She liked to open the cupboards at night while they were sleeping.
Oh my gosh. That's crazy.
So that's one of the many home stories.
That's a good one too. That's a very good one. Let's see here. We have a couple more questions. This is a running question that one of our, he's usually in chat, he's traveling at the time, but this is a question he usually asks is, what is one thing in this world you would not want to be haunted?
One thing I would not want to be haunted? Thing?
Mm-hmm. Like any kind of object that you wouldn't want to be haunted.
Oh. Gosh. Well, I don't want any of my kids' toys to be haunted. I don't want anything to do with my kids.
That's a good answer. Good answer.
And my kids go to Garnett House, and my son works there with me, so
nice.
there's not a fear of, I have an 11-year-old daughter, and she's fearless, but she doesn't. My kids don't investigate, but at all. They've never done that, but they've been to this place. They've been a few other places with me over the years. So I just don't want anything like that they own to be haunted.
Yeah, I wouldn't want that either. All right, looking here. I think we got one more here. What is the strangest thing you have ever had happen on an investigation?
Wow. The strangest thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think, some of them I can't tell you. I can't say that. But I'll find one that I can.
Okay.
I think one of them, another strange thing, and this has to do with a cell phone EVP that I captured. We were at the Alexander Major's house doing our bit with Harvey. Now, Alexander Major's house is an antebellum home that the freighter, there was a guy from Kansas City area, his name was Alexander Majors, he was a freighter, famous Old West figure. He was one of the founders of the Pony Express. But he lived in Kansas City for a short period, but his home's a museum. So we were upstairs, and we're investigating. And Harvey's talking, and Harvey can talk a lot. And when he's investigating with you over the cell phone, but you never know where Harvey's going to go. He might be telling you about ghosts, or he might be viewing that your brakes need changing on your car, and you go have them checked, and that sure enough, your brakes need changing. But so he's talking, and Harvey's going on, and all of a sudden, this voice comes over the cell phone, and this is loud as can be. This man's voice goes, "Shut up!" right in the middle of Harvey's speech, and that made us jump. We're like, "What? Harvey, was that you? Who was that?" And he's like, "What? What are y'all talking about?" Because he can't hear it. We find that these things happen one way, so we'll hear it, but Harvey hears things happening on his side as well that we can't hear through the cell phones. So that's kind of the strange dynamic of this. So that's kind of one of the weird tales of happened. Another one is I happened to run through the bat-filled basement at the old Harrison Street Church to retrieve a camera. There used to be a church in Topeka called the Harrison Street Church. It was on what was the old show where they were the college kids from Pennsylvania from the college. Brian Boyle and all them used to be on. They had been there to this location, and we went there, and the place was, very dilapidated and fallen down, but it doesn't exist anymore. Homeless people accidentally burned it to the ground. But there's a basement, and there was bats in there. And to put cameras down there where you needed them, you had to run through this gauntlet of bats to get this camera to put it there, and you had to run out. And that was one of my most terrifying wildlife stories, was running through this basement while these bats fly by my head, trying to put the camera in and retrieve the camera later that night. So it's not always ghosts. There's always wildlife you could run into as well.
That is insane.
And if you go to Waverly Hills, you'll encounter bats as well.
Oh my gosh, no, thank you.
You like to fly
That's one
down
thing
the
I
hallway.
don't like.
Yeah, I think we've caught a couple, I think, on our cameras from Edinburgh, but I've never had one actually fly by my head yet at an investigation. Knock on wood.
Yeah, knock on wood there.
You don't know they're there until I had trap cameras set up at Waverly Hills because that's like hiking on concrete. I mean, it's 7 floors and plus that death tunnel of the body chute of just walking and carrying your equipment. And but I had these cameras set up, and you later on reviewed the footage, and I said, there's 10 bats that just flew past our heads and we didn't even know it.
Oh my gosh. That is so creepy. Now I'm going to be thinking about that every time we're on an investigation.
Give me dolls any day. You can keep the bats.
I don't really want them either, truth be told.
All right. So once again, if you want to just, before we wrap things up, kind of give us the information on where they can locate information on the Garnett House, information about you, where they can follow you, look up at your videos.
So my website for Elite Paranormal of Kansas City is www.eliteparanormalkc.com. Now that has links to all the social media on there. That'll take you to Facebook and all that stuff, and YouTube. So I have a lot of YouTube videos out there. Lately I've been streaming Garnett House quite a bit on there, just doing live streams I haven't put out a lot of just investigation stuff, but I will. I'll get back to it. And for the Garnett House, it's www.1858hotel.com. And if you go there, you can see a little bit of the history, a little bit of some of the investigation stuff that's been done in there, and also how you can privately book the location. And there'll be more coming on that website as well. As we can get back to normal. I had history tours all scheduled, and COVID-19 hit and wiped the slate clean. So I'm waiting on the word when I can get back to doing that as well. So, we're going to have probably some more events come up. It's just got to get things back to normal.
Right. Yep. Understandable there.
But that'll link you. There's links on there as well for all the social media stuff for the hotel.
Okay. Perfect. And like I said, I'll make sure to get that information posted on our social media as well. So if people didn't get it jotted down, they can look at our social media and we'll have it posted on there in the next day or two. So I'll be checking for that. Real quick here, I'm going to give some shout outs to everybody who was in chat tonight. We had myself, we had Kim, we had Christopher, Nico, Shay, Matt, and Mama Deb. So thank you everybody who joined us in chat tonight. Thank you everybody who was listening but not in chat. We appreciate each and every one of you. Next week we have Casey.
Yeah.
She had a show on here called Cauldron Talk. She's going to be on next week. She's got some interesting things coming up, so she's going to be discussing that, so stay tuned for that. We'd like to thank our special guest for tonight, Rob Garcia from Elite Paranormal KC. Thank you so much for being on. Thank you for all the awesome history information. We like to get those on here every now and then with all that history because, it's nice to hear some of that background about some of these different locations that we're able to go to. So thank you for sharing
you're
all
welcome.
that with us.
If you come to Garnett House, you get about an hour's worth of history from me. I'm long-winded, so
that's okay. No worries. Like I said, after I read about this place, I'm like, oh my gosh, we have to get there. So we will have to book it, and we will have to get there and make a trip out of it. I think it's about 5 hours for us, but it'll be worth it. So.
Oh yeah, it's never too far to go.
No, it's not. It's not. All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we will see you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to REP Paranormal and Friends. Be sure to check out Kim and Allison on Facebook at REP Paranormal Busters.